looks like we've got a quorum of our members. A smaller crowd than usual, but that's all right. I know it's the summertime. So why don't we just start kind of introductions, just go around the table here. So,
Marissa Weinberg, Forestry, Fire, and State Land.
And Jeff DenBleyker with Jacobs.
Christine Rumsey, U.S. Geological Survey.
Ryan Rowland, U.S. Geological Survey.
Joe Havasi, Compass Minerals.
Andrew Rupp, Utah Geological Survey.
John Lott, Wildlife Resources.
Jennifer Biggs, Forestry, Fire, and State Land.
And then online. Oh, I'm sorry.
Vernon, Water Resources.
You should be at the table.
I think there's space today.
There is.
Feels a little awkward back here.
I thought I saw Lynn here. Stepped out. Let's see, and then online, I see Elliot Jagnicki from UGS, Krishna Khatri from Water Resources, Leila Ahmadi from Water Resources, Rob Dubuque with Friends, Bill Johnson at the University of Utah. That is everybody. All right. Well, good. And just a quick overview of our agenda today. I feel like there's a lot to cover, a lot to discuss for sure. One of the key objectives of our meeting today is just to talk through what we've observed here this spring and how the salinity has changed. And I guess one of the key outcomes I'd like to get today is some clarity on, well, what are the key data gaps that we have, or calculations that we need to make, or sampling we need to do, so that we are set and able to, and next month, is to be able to really evaluate if and how much the berm should be modified. And so I think there's a lot of work that's happened by a number of you here in the last month, and so eager to talk about that. But then also, I know one thing that Ben had wanted to make sure we keep on the table is just how can we need to discuss the development of this decision about the berm, but we also need to talk about how we can I guess start to develop that long-term salinity management management plan for the lake. That means we need to dovetail into the comprehensive management plan that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is going to be developing. I think it's also, and I'll talk a little bit about this, it's also going to need to dovetail into the basin integrated plan that the Division of Water Resources is going to be developing over the next 3 years as well. So there's a lot of connections there, and I guess I want to make sure we're keeping that on the front burner. We're not that's not falling off the stove per se. So I guess the first couple of things are Ryan and Christine are going to give us an update on the lake conditions. I did send out the edited SOP for water density measurement salinity calculation for your review, and I guess what I'd like to do today is vote on that. We can approve those changes, and so we can get that published. And I know there's more and more people interested in the lake, and we need to make sure that people know what they're doing and how they should be doing it. And then, as I mentioned, we want to talk about the berm modifications and then long-term planning. So any questions or anything else that we should make sure we talk about today? All right. Hearing none, I also sent out in the packet to the committee members our summaries of our meetings on March 23rd and May 17th. Our last meeting was May 17th, so that represents, so that's our last meeting summary. If you might recall, I think I had sent out the March 23rd summary like a week after that meeting because it was pertinent to the recommendations we were making with the berm. protocol. But then I forgot to send it out to you again for May 17th, and and understandably it had been filed and nobody had a chance to look at it. So I guess what I'd like to do is see if there's any comments or changes to those summaries, and I guess vote to approve with our name. So any comments from committee members or alternates? I see Ben. Hey, Ben.
Hey, Jeff. Sorry I'm a little late. It sounded like you were just taking updates. I did have an update I'd like to give if it's time for that.
I understand you are heading into a meeting. Is that imminent, or?
I'm going to be, I drove up early so I could stay on the meeting the whole time. I'll just be joining virtually, so I'll be around the whole meeting.
Great. Awesome. Well, right now, just asking if there's any comments on the meeting summaries from March 23rd and May 17th. So no, I don't hear any comments on those or changes. Is there a motion to approve those?
Do we have quorum? We established quorum?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So moved.
Moved. All right. Any discussion? Hearing none, is there a second?
I second.
All right. And then although for committee members and their alternates, all those in favor of approving both of those summaries, vote yes.
Yes.
Any opposed?
I'm going to defer to Mark. He was the elder and was president though. So go ahead and vote.
Okay. All right. Great. I guess hearing none, we will finalize those. Those are approved, and we'll finalize those summaries. Thank you. So next item is the update on lake condition.
You want to start with Ben or Christine and I?
Well, Ben, why don't you give us your update if you can?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to give an update on the recommendation the Salinity Committee made to the division and to water quality on the Berm protocol. I just wanted to basically give an update that we have not adopted that formally yet. Our intent is to have a meeting with Brian Steed after he takes his position on July 1st, and just ensure that he's completely on board with our adoption of that protocol before we do anything. As you all know, that Brian has the ability to supersede our agency decisions, so we felt like it was going to be advantageous to make sure he had complete buy-in on that before we adopt anything. So that was it.
All right. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Did we give you a thumb drive?
I'm going to share it.
Yeah,
Okay,
you can
cool.
share.
Okay, well, we're going to do our usual update. So I'm going to take care of lake elevation and discharge velocity data, and then Christine will jump into the salinity information. Lake surface elevation at our salt air gauge, the daily mean value as of June 20th was 4194.0 feet. We're up about 5.5 feet since the low in November of 2022. So I'm just showing data from October 2021 to current on the plot shown to the left. And so, yeah, real nice jump in water surface elevations for the south arm. But for the north arm, data from our saline gauge, the daily mean value on June 20th was 4189.3 feet. We're only up about 0.8 of a foot on the north arm since the record low in November of 2022. And I'm showing the same period of data on the plot for the saline gauge. And you can see how recent water surface elevations at the saline gauge are kind of appear to be leveling off. And I think that case is the same on the previous slide. I forgot to mention. Let's go back to the previous slide. So the rate of increase for the salt air gauge, so the south arm of the lake, we switch back to the salt air gauge slide. You see the rate of increase lately for lake elevation has slowed down relative to what we've seen previously. So just want to point that out. So 5.5 foot increase for the south arm and 0.8 of a foot increase for the north arm of the lake since the low in November. And on this plot, I'm showing data for both sites on the same plot. So the red line is for the south arm or the Saltair gauge, and then the green line is for the saline or the north arm gauge. And I'm showing the same period of record, I think October 2022 to present. And you see just the behavior of the two lakes in response, or two arms in response to our runoff season. And obviously, the north arm response has not been concurrent with the south arm response. And as we all know, this is related to the berm, which is at an elevation of 4192. So that just puts the information in a little perspective, seeing it all together like that. Next slide. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the major surface water inflows. So here I'm showing a cumulative flow plot, millions of acre feet on the y-axis. This is first plot is for the Bear River near Corinne, Utah. The bold black line is the current water year. Blue line is the highest measured cumulative flow. Orange line is the lowest, and then the green area represents the 25th to 75th percentile, and then that light gray line in the middle of the green is the median.
So these are chronological by the date on the bottom.
So then the data on the bottom is for a water year. The bold black line is the current shows data for water year 2023. Okay. The other lines are based on the period of record, historic period of record. So currently for Bear River at Corinne, 1.1 million acre feet of water has passed that gauge. So we're above the 50th percentile or the median, and we're not quite exceeding the 75th percentile. So it's been a good water year so far at this gauge, very good, especially relative to the last few years. But you know, we're not anywhere near the highest ever measured, which is the blue line, and that was measured in 1984. If you hit the next button, Christine. We now are looking at the same type of plot for the Weber River near Plain City gauge. So the bold black line for the current water year, as of June 20th, about 500,000 acre feet or 492,000 acre feet have passed that gauge, and we're just above the 75th percentile relative to the historic data for this site. So another very healthy year, certainly relative to the last few years, but you know. We'll just leave it at that. It's a healthy year at this gauge as well.
So a real quick question about that. Does that, I know a lot of water got diverted from the Weber over to Willard that then goes out through the Bear River. Is that I don't know where that gauge is. Is that before or after that?
And who, I don't know for certain. Does anyone know for certain?
I think this other gauge was Corinne, and so it's before whatever flowed in through Willard.
Yeah, Bear River, Corinne.
Yeah, that one is, but there's Weber River water that is then diverted over to Willard Bay that then comes out into Bear River Bay that flows into the lake. So there's that wouldn't be accounted for at the Corinne gauge.
Or at Plain City.
But that's what I was wondering.
It's that diversion happens before Plain City. There you go. So that volume to Willard Bay is not accounted for in these river gauges.
Right. And so anything flowing out of Willard Bay,
right,
then we would be missing from the Bear River inflow into the
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, these are just our long-term gauges, and they don't represent all the inflow of the Great Salt Lake, obviously.
It just seems like, I mean, accounting for some of that would be. Yeah. Well, and as we all know, I mean, there's Jake's Water Resources. They're looking into this very carefully on how to better account, measure all the inflow of the Great Salt Lake, not all, but
improve on this for sure, this gauging network. So that's the Weber Plain City. So, 492,000 acre feet so far, just about 75th percentile relative to historic data. Hit next. Farmington Bay outflow gauge, a very good water year at this gauge. So currently 323,000 acre feet, or at least that's as of June 20th. That's how much water is past that gauge, and relative to the historic record for June 20th, that's an all-time high. So lots of water moving past that Farmington Bay outflow gauge. Next slide, or excuse me, next button. Now we have the Gog and Drain near Magna, Utah. 164,000 acre feet is past that gauge so far. This water year, we're right basically at the 75th percentile based on the period of record at that site. So another site where we have healthy flows, especially relative to those drought years, the last few years that we've experienced. The information to the right. So basically, I'm just summing up those cumulative flows for each gauge for water year 2023 at the top of the information on the right. And if you total those up for the Bear, Weber, Farmington Bay outflow, and Gog and Drain as of June 20th, 2.09 million acre feet of water have passed our major inflow gauges. The information below is just comparing that number and the numbers for the individual gauges to the 2011 water year, which was the last really big water year that we've had. And the cumulative amount of water passing the gauges as of June 20th and 2011 was 2.77 million acre feet. So this water year, we're a little less than where we were in 2011 at this time.
Do we have a measure of the direct precipitation on the lake or an estimate of that?
I don't have that information. I don't put that information together.
We're approaching, I think, like 11 or 12 inches at the Salt Lake Airport.
Yeah.
And if you applied that to 800,000 acres of lake surface,
Yes.
that would make another one. My recollection from 1983 was the total inflow of the lake was estimated over 5 million.
Yeah.
And the snowpack, I think, would tell me that I've got still more water in the system that will come down over time. Yeah. And we've also filled up quite a bit of reservoir storage. Do you have a view on how much went into Bear Lake at this point?
Yeah. What you're saying is absolutely correct. I don't have the numbers.
So I'm just trying to guess where the lake's actually going to go.
Yeah.
We went back and reviewed 1983, and the lake kind of peaked out on July 1st. And then it came down 0.6 by September when it started going back up again. Because what we've done here, we've confused ourselves with this barrier across the breach opening. So it's pretty complex to estimate what's going to happen. But by having a late peak, you also set yourself up for further increases next year because you haven't had a decrease that started in mid-March to July. You've lost kind of like half your evaporative season.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. Yeah.
Hopefully, just one more dynamic that's mentioned across this year is we're off the close to compromise level in but
Well, I saw Deer Creek is spilling. I don't think I've ever seen Deer Creek spill. So I think I was asking Craig Miller about that. Like, well, where did all the snow go? And I think the answer is that they've done a great job of filling our reservoirs. And I think they're all approaching full, and now they're starting to spill. So,
And you've kind of seen that. You had like 10 days or 2 weeks where it was pretty much flat on the marina gauge, and now it started creeping up a little bit. So I think that was a fill period is what we're observing there.
on the NRCS website, we also track soil moisture. So we were terrible heading into this year, and now we're average, slightly above average generally. That's another sink, but that gets us in good position for next year. Don't be just fill up potatoes.
Yeah, I'm still smiling about the snowpack and the benefits we're reaping with the delay. Cooler temperatures, keeping evaporation down. Yeah, it's it's a good year.
And we can
No
talk
doubt.
about El Super Nino that they're predicting. For the next 90 days, we're supposed to be above normal precipitation.
All right, I'll keep smiling. It's a,
Unless you're in the evaporation business, then you don't like it so well.
That's true. All right, next. Okay, so the new breach. So as you know, we make monthly measurements of discharge out there. So the blue circles are south to north, red circles are north to south. The gray line is the elevation difference between the south arm and the north arm. And you see the left axis is for discharge in cubic feet per second, and the right axis is elevation difference, 8 feet, and showing data from July 2021 to the most recent data that we have. And also the vertical dash lines are showing when the berm was raised at the site. So we have a late July berm modification that was raised to 4187, and then in early February, the berm was raised to 4192. Not surprising, those blue circles dive down, when the berm was raised to 4187. And then as the elevation difference began to increase, flow even over that raised berm, flows moving south to north began to increase again. So you see those two blue circles just before the vertical dash line representing the 4192 berm modification. And you see the north to south flows are all very, very low, near zero, the red circles. As the elevation of the lake has been, or of the south arm has risen since the berm modification in February, the blue circles, the south and north discharge values have been creeping up. And the most recent value was June 6th, and I think that's 898 cubic feet per second. And there's not a corresponding north to south value, but it's probably zero. The data are very noisy, as you might imagine, at that deeper in the water column at the bridge, at the breach. Is there a question? Yeah.
I think that was the day they actually didn't observe any stratification. So there was an exist.
Okay. So all the flow was south to north, 898 CFS. That was June, I think June 6th. And we have another measurement coming up. We're almost into July, so we'll make another measurement there. And you see the tremendous rise in the elevation difference where the south arm is higher than the north arm. And most recently, 4.5 feet higher. If we're looking at the elevation difference between the south and the north arms. And that's it for, I think, my information. Is there? Oh, one more. We have an uplooker velocity sensor at the new breach. This is data coming from the original Sontec ADCP that's only measuring 10 locations. I still don't have data ready from the new Nortec ADCP that's measuring 50 locations, but that's okay. This is a very interesting plot nonetheless. So here I have water velocity in feet per second on the left axis, lake surface elevation on the right axis. The brownish line at the top is lake surface elevation, and then the blue and the pink lines are water velocities for two depths measured by that Sontec ADCP. I'm only showing two depths for simplicity here, and they're the shallower depths. I think 4190 and 4192 are the two depths. And basically the lake elevation data out on the far left at April 12th it's basically at 4192. So the lake is at the top of the berm and just about to start spilling over in earnest. And so the water velocity data at that same time are hovering around zero for those two locations. And then you see as you get to May, the water velocity data is creeping into higher positive values, which means south to north. By May 14th, we're up to close to 0.5 feet per second. And then what's really interesting and just gives us faith in just how miraculous these instruments actually are, these acoustic Doppler instruments are, is at June 12th, you see a step increase in velocities. And I have a hunch, I haven't confirmed this, but I think there was a storm event there, because the brown line, which is lake surface elevation, has a big wiggle. That usually means there's been a big wind event causing a sesh of some kind. I think we had a significant wind event that day, big waves hitting against that berm and probably eroded a little piece of the top of the berm away and allowed water to accelerate even faster across the berm. And we see the response in that instrument. That's my hypothesis on this right now.
The other dynamic is interesting. I think that's fascinating that if you've seen the berm firsthand, is it was cut to start to cut a V notch.
There you go.
And I wonder if that did.
Yes. Yeah. And so, yeah. And, there's another even slight step increase between May 21st and May 28th might represent another event there where kind of eroded the base of that berm. So I just wanted to point out just how fantastic that technology really is. This for monitoring velocity. This is technology. Okay, that's it for me.
Okay, jumping into salinity. This is the plot we're all used to. I made a little modification, which is just add the salinity from all of the 4 Great Lake Ecosystem Program sites. And those are shown on the map in the top right. But we have salinity on the y-axis from about April 2010 to present. You see the patterns we're all familiar with. We have a deep layer that mixes out during certain conditions. I think what we're most interested in here is this more recent salinity concentrations. We see them continue to plummet. Our last measurement from GSLEP samples was on June 5th. And at 3510 in the shallow layer, we saw about 132 grams per liter. That was the same at 0.5 and 3 meters below surface. At 2565 in Parrington Bay, the concentration was 124 grams per liter. And then, I think at 3 meters, it was 125. So just a little bit different. And then for the deep samples, we're seeing higher salinities, not really indicative of a deep brine layer fed by North Arm water, but kind of trapped, previous South Arm water down there. And those are around 151 to 158 grams per liter. So continuing to see that come down. Another thing to note is that when I add on salinities from 2267, which is our site that is kind of influenced by Bear River, we can see those in blue here. They, very commonly tend to be below other salinities observed in the South Arm. And that's especially true this year and right now. On July 5th, the shallow salinity there was about 89 grams per liter, so much more dilute there than at our others.
So that gray band is kind of a normalized.
This is the 120 to 160 gram per liter that the Salinity Advisory Committee has kind of identified as preferred salinity, just to kind of put it into context. So seeing really steep declines in salinity right now, also verified by other measurements. At Saltaire, our most recent measurement was May 22nd, 124 grams per liter. That tends to be more dilute than our kind of open Gilbert Bay salinities. New Breach on June 9th, that was 114. Again, seeing kind of that dilute plug of water influencing both New Breach and 2565. And then UGS did their lake-wide sampling, South Arm sampling on May 31st. And they got salinities ranging from 117 to 153 grams per liter. And we can take a closer look at that data. If we look at kind of zoomed in conditions of the last couple of years, this plot goes from October of 2021 to the present, just to kind of give us an idea of how these things have been fluctuating. Salinity has been fluctuating in the last couple of years. Most notably, again, we got salinities as high as 185 to 186 grams per liter last November. And again, now we're seeing 132 to 134. So that's a change at 3510 of about 53 grams per liter decrease. At 2565, about 62 grams per liter decrease. And here I just kind of include a full summary of June 5th shallow salinities as measured by in the GSLEP samples that were collected then. So ranging from 89 to 132, kind of hovering around 120 at some 5 at the other 2 sites. And I am continuing to build out these maps to illustrate spatial variability. So beginning last September, you can see we had kind of consistently high salinities at all of these 4 sites. These are shallow samples, so 0.5 meters below the surface. And then we begin to see kind of heterogeneity starting in January of this year, where we see influence of Bear River Bay. That persists until the present, where we continuously see more dilute conditions at that site influenced by the Bear River outflow, and just gradual decrease in salinity across the board. Okay, so now we're going to jump into all of the questions. And I want to preface this by saying that we USGS feels we kind of need to quadruple check these. We're kind of paranoid about sharing preliminary data. It's all very preliminary, but we wanted to do this assessment to help inform decisions you need to make. So first question was, which salinity value do we use as representative of the South Arm? And so that we were trying to use our most recent conditions that have been observed. So this first attempt was using the UGS data that was collected on May 31st. The raw data is just included here at the right to give you a sense of what that looks like. There's 4 different sites. UGS collects data every 5 feet roughly and throughout the water column. And you can see the associated salinities there. So taking this data set, how do we come up with a representative salinity? My thought process here was that the best salinity would be a volume weighted average. So that means I'm kind of following the method that was used in Muhammad and Tarbotten, where I take each concentration where it was kind of collected, I give it kind of an interval in the water column, and then I associate a volume with that, and I sum those throughout the water column, basically computing a mass for each of these layers. And then I end up with an overall South Arm salt mass, but then I divide by it for the volume. That's this top one here. This top one I kind of separated also into the 2 separate bays of Carrington Bay and Gilbert Bay. They both have different bathymetries. So I associated this RT4 site, which is the UGS's Carrington Bay site, and then the rest kind of took an average to represent Gilbert Bay. So using that approach, I get a salinity, volume-weighted average salinity of 136 grams per liter. The next one is just kind of not separating it into 2 bays, but the same approach, 137. And then I didn't do this fancy volume weighted average. I just took averages of different combinations of these data to see how it compared to that, kind of considering that the best estimate. And if we do it from all depths, it's really within reason, 137. If I just look at the salinities from the 5, 10, and 15 foot depths, because the really shallow samples seem to be a little bit more dilute, the really deep samples seem to be a little more saline. So if I just take that middle chunk, I get 136 grams per liter. That's most comparable to this volume weighted average concentration. If I kind of just look at the top, so 0.5 to 15 feet, it's skewed low, 133 grams per liter. And then if I look at the lower samples from 5 to 20 feet, over 20 feet, 141. So just to give you a sense of how the different computations of the average change the answer. And there may be more ways, there are many ways to slice and dice it. These are the things that I did. I also used the USGS/GSLEP data collected from June 5th using similar approach. So volume weighted concentration, 134 grams per liter. So there's some differences in these raw data, which is that there are, we don't collect it quite the number of sites throughout the water column that UGS does. But so we collect at 0.5, 3, and at a deep sample kind of on the bottom at 2 sites, and then at the other ones it's just on the surface and just at depth. So I was pretty encouraged to see it's fairly close, and 34 grams per liter. And then I did a whole bunch of other iterations. You can see here they're more variable in their answers than the UGS data set was. And the best one that compares to this volume weighted average concentration was taking the average of all the salinity minus that shallow sample at 2267, which is the one influenced by the Berm Bay outflow. So hopefully that gives you some idea. That these are my recommendations, these highlights of how you would compute the average, or what's the representative salinity. 136 and 135 grams per liter. So that's we can debate that, or that's what I
that's great stuff. One question, Christine, when you do the salt mass calculation, are you using the volume weighted concentration?
Yes, that's how I'm doing it. Yeah, and then here's actually the actual salt mass.
Okay.
That computed from those 2 different data sets, 2 bays, and then using the volume. So looking at right now, we have about 1,100 million tons roughly. There is some difference, 2% difference between these 2 data sets. But that's kind of where we're sitting at this moment. And I'm just going to keep going through the questions that Jeff kind of sent, if that's okay for you to wait.
Would you be okay if we talked about what that average number we should use there? I guess I think one other key thing here is that UGS was about a week before your USGS measurement. And so may have had some more dilution
Yes.
with added inflow. But I guess, what do you all think in terms of how we compute that magic number that we use to make our decisions? And just as a reminder, the protocol that we have indicates that our goal is to have a salinity of less than 130 in the spring. So we're remarkably close to that. But, yes, Bill.
Yeah, Christine, really nice analysis. And to summarize it, it looks like if you have values from 3 or more depths at reasonably spaced locations, then you can get a reasonable number. And so it seems to me that that's your formula, and the one that you bolded is a good one. But there isn't much, once you've got 3 or more depths, there isn't much variability, and that's great. So you've proven you got a robust method, and so I think we can go with the one that you bolded.
Great. Thanks, Bill. I second that.
Here's a question a little bit. Where do the brine shrimp live? Are they evenly distributed bottom to top?
Wish we knew.
Left here? Left ought to know. He does the sampling and stuff, right?
Only we have that.
I was actually gonna ask Phil about it, because are you seeing something strange out there right now?
Well, we're trying to get out. It's been difficult. I mean, they live throughout the water column. I think it's only just oxygenated water. And as far as like even distribution, at any given point, it's not even all across, but they utilize the entire.
So it's pretty much the whole column. Where's the algae at? Everywhere? I would expect it just on some years when we had a high salinity but got rainfall in August, the brine shrimp harvest went up because they appeared to be influenced that way. Not true.
Yeah, because what Phil's saying, that oxygen is greater in lower salinity. So if the salinity column is stratified, then they're
going to migrate to the
they're going to
oxygen.
spend more energy doing osmolar regulation of salinity. So they'll probably move out.
So that makes sense. So
And the algae also swim, so they will go to their happy place.
pretty weak.
Don't sell it down.
They're not making the Olympics. I'm just telling you, Bobby.
So every year we say it's a big different year. So there's no
Science involved.
normals, but that's what I was wondering, because we noticed there's this anoxic layer below 4 meters this year, which is not something that we've seen in right at 4 meters. And our guess is that all of the influx of phytoplankton that's coming in through the inflows have been shocked by the higher salinities, and then the decomposition of those may be using up a lot of the oxygen. I don't know, and we've seen that over the last month or so on our samples, which is different. And this is, I mean, it sort of has something to do with salinity and sort of doesn't. I think just all of that inflows that we're not used to seeing, and then the start off high salinity probably played a role in this.
Is there any salinity gradient corresponding to that?
So
it doesn't take much.
Yeah, so we were seeing a hint in the water and a slight smell to it. And then the most recent one, it was more pronounced.
Yeah, we've seen something similar to that around 5 meters. Like Christine mentioned, I don't think it's a deep brine layer fed by the north arm, but when you have a column of water that starts out at 160 grams per liter, and you get a bunch of fresh water dumping in, and it doesn't mix all the way down, it doesn't take long for that layer to isolate, and then you start to get the typical oxygen usage from bacteria down there, and that can lower the concentration of oxygen and start to create some of that nitrogen sulfide in the water. So we have seen something similar to that.
Okay.
When we sampled, there's a very clear break between the two zones. There's a very marked temperature difference, like 10 or 15 degrees C or something like that. We picked it up in our northern sites at 15 feet, 20 feet, something more so.
I was reading a paper about the shrimp increasing the pigments in their hemolymph when they have low oxygen, so that they can optimize oxygen for oxygen.
Yeah, we definitely see that once they come off peak on that first population gain, and they strip the water column of phytoplankton, and salt water doesn't hold much oxygen on its own, so they start to become oxygen stressed as well, and they turn color.
Yeah. Cool. I was thinking that was that. Yeah.
Okay,
Can I
Yes.
ask one question? Looking farther ahead, maybe once you agree on a representative number, will that number be out in public, like put it on a hydromapper, or so like all of the public are seeing, also the same agreed upon number? That
That makes sense.
then thought of.
Yeah,
or thought
that makes
Sorry.
sense. Yeah, once we codify this method, yeah, we should get the hydromapper to agree with it. So then everybody's on the same page. I like it. Yeah.
Christine, when I look at FB2 and RT4, I really agree with throwing out the 20-foot depth, but you see a pretty significant step change from 10 to 15 at those two locations. FB2 jumping 132 to 150, and then the 20-footish sample being 151. It definitely, that location, it feels like it's being skewed high. And you see kind of this maybe a little more muted in RT4. So I guess I have questions as to why 15 would be included. I'm not understanding that 0.5, it would be subject to dilution.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, we could do another iteration of like the 5 and 10 and just see what that is. While it may have skewed it a bit high, it didn't seem to make enough of a difference. I mean, it still compares to that.
That's probably a good point, because this probably works for this year,
Yeah,
but whether
right.
it would apply in the future,
I think it's very condition specific.
yeah, I'm not sure.
I could compute it really fast for you, Joe, if you want. See what 5 and 10 is. But I see your point. It's like maybe we should just leave out the 15 because it's going to be skewed high. But I mean, I guess the objective is to not kind of, we still want a representative average. So, you know what I mean? We don't just, even though they're higher, we still want that salt mass. We still want to know kind of what the overall salinity is.
But I mean, going back to last year, we were trying to correct salinity to save the brine shrimp population towards ensuring that there wasn't going to be a migratory bird issue, right? So we've taken and recommended good but extreme actions in constructing a berm. So I just keep that in my mind. What was the original objective for this? So if we're including data in parts of the water column, have nominal impact to brine shrimp population. But in my mind, that's what we're trying to solve for and manage.
Well,
That's my opinion. But
isn't that going to mix in? I mean, that'll mix in though at some point, I would think. And so it seems like that is at some point the brine shrimp population.
hold that thought. Bill, you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I just want to remind folks that, when you're doing something like this, you're choosing between an explicit set of numbers, in which case, if you want to be explicit, then report the values in all 4 layers, right? And that's more akin to what Joe's referring to, I think. When you're doing something representative, you're looking for something that correlates, something that, that you're shaving the corners off the realistic picture. in order to have something that's representative. So you just have to live with that if that's the route you're going to go. So, you know, just recognize that difference, whether you're just trying to get something representative that you know that you're corner cutting versus something explicit. And I think this representative approach is good based on these numbers that Christine presented.
It's just that the berm management plan hinges on
Right.
on the number, right? So it's important.
And I think this, and I think the other angle to this is we're computing this based on our spring numbers, and you know, I think we're dropping the 0.5 depth because that's where we're seeing that freshwater lens. This fall, when we compute this number, we won't have that lens.
Maybe not.
Maybe or maybe not.
We got 6.7 inches of rain in September of 1982 in 2 days.
To that end, I mean, you know, I see better or more value in the 0.5, including 0.5 and the 15, as opposed to shedding the 0.5 and the 15. I mean, Bill's point, we want that representative, and you know, over time you'll be able to see the fluctuation with that possibly seasonal.
And you've got this kind of thing too to consider. You've got a guy with each foot in a bucket of ice water, and you light his hair on fire. His average temperature may be just fine. So when you're looking at what salinity are we going to pick, it's obviously going to be a range, and you know, there may be an optimal salinity for brine shrimp. It may be different for an optimal range for brine flies, and it certainly would be different for mineral extraction. But this is being managed for multiple uses. So if we got a curve from the brine shrimp guys that say 1.216 is optimal and we're fine between X and Y, we have it in our old chart, supposedly.
Yeah, I think when we talked about the values for the protocol, that was where we talked about what is optimal for, I think specifically in the spring, it's the concern is hatching. You need for the brine, our team need to be able to hatch in the spring to start that cascading population dynamics that we have each year.
So those brine pigs float, those brine shrimp pigs float?
Well, as I recall, they are all throughout the water column.
Buoyancy isn't simple with them.
About half of them float, don't they? That was
Depends on the year. Yeah, sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Depends on the salinity. If it's lower salinity, then it probably doesn't float well.
And I don't want to, I mean, I guess I'm also thinking in terms of somebody is going to be tasked with calculating these numbers. I'm not sure if that's.
Why can't we use a computer for that?
Well,
we just come up with a formula,
right.
And we honestly could do this in real time. So if we decide on the formula, then we have a real time. I mean, there's no sense in a human actually doing that.
Right. And I think what I'm getting at is, I know one of the numbers we need to compute is the salt mass. And I guess that's why I was asking the question earlier is we have to compute the salt mass to be able to forecast the salinity in the fall. And yes, we can take, you know, the computer, we can automate that based on measurements that are being made. And I think here we see, you know, UGS is measuring at slightly different depths, and then feet, you know, USGS with the different programs they're sampling with are at certain depths and meters. How, you know, can we automate those conversions? And I'm just thinking ahead of, you know, 5 feet versus, you know, 9 feet. Just, yes, go ahead, Ben.
Hearing what Bill said and listening to Joe, I think that this idea of representative versus explicit numbers serve different purposes and different audiences. And, you know, maybe the hydromapper number doesn't have to be the same number. We could have a more complex understanding for this committee. But the hydromapper number is something that's publicly facing. And those two numbers don't have to be the same. We could have ranges, we could understand depth, we could be more complicated in this committee than the outward facing number. But we have to have the numbers for this committee will guide management decisions, right? So that's got to have all of the intelligences that we need embedded in the formula.
But whatever number we pick, someone's going to manage to it. We've got Great Salt Lake Commissioner who's going to be tasked with saying, when it reaches this point, we're going to act.
Right.
So you have to understand that that will have to play into how the decisions develop.
Exactly.
Let's not cry wolf before the wolf shows.
Just one thing to keep in mind is the G-slip sampling, where the USGS salinity numbers are coming from. That sampling is happening monthly. The UGS sampling,
Or twice a year.
Twice a year.
For myself, so. When, not to oversimplify this, but when you harvest the brine, what is the depth range sort of past your net?
The harvest is quite shallow. And so we're relying on currents, magic, voodoo magic, particular streams.
So the cysts originate from the brine chunks that are spread throughout the water column.
And they can be low, they can be high, there's variance if you've got a deep brine layer present or absent. And we've tried to predict it, correlate it to salinity and correlate it to potency, but just correlate. Some years you may have more cysts. It's like,
and make little radio frequency collars for them and track them.
I could, but I don't know if they'd use them.
We come with a lot of things that would have been possible, but yeah, it's really dynamic point seems very hard to predict, and you'd think that as the salinity goes higher points, it would automatically increase denser water, but that doesn't always pan out to be the case, and there's always a possibility of coordinates tailoring points to the cysts to the condition that they're being produced in, and it's not something that we have a good handle on. That'd be some pretty intense cellular biology to try to track down.
And I think you guys make pros on that. I mean, I sound really stupid here, but the birds, they need the cyst to the brine.
Depends on the bird.
Yeah, and probably ought to mention brine flies too, that not just totally focus on brine shrimp, because birds eat brine flies, or at least important.
When you say flow, is it 50-50, 90-10?
So this table, I mean, I don't have numbers on here, because it's not really based on it's probably figure, but different species eat different things, some overlap and both flies and shrimp.
And
I think this would be helpful for everyone that
Yeah.
is ignorant as I sound.
No.
Amongst the experts here, I don't know this. So.
I kind of ignorant when I got
Ben has his hand up here. Go ahead, Ben. Or maybe not.
Oh, sorry. I took my hand down, but forgot to unmute myself. Apologies for not being there in person. I thought it'd be relevant to remind everybody the reason, why this is so important that we get this right on this measurement as well, because it's not just the berm management. HB 513 also had emergency triggers that I don't think necessarily need to be tied to the berm, but I think that like understanding a uniform way to measure salinity might inform when those emergency triggers could be invoked, and maybe it's not solely based on salinity at all, but I do think that representing, the water column and trying to take out the anomalies, like when we have freshwater lenses or when we have a more robust deep brine layer, I do think there's some benefit in trying to just find the area or fine tune this salinity measure to the area where the most concern exists, which is the ecosystem and the ecological values. So I really liked the way Christine put this together, and I think it captures that. But I do think we need to realize that in the broad scheme, this is going to impact, potentially future rules on how that emergency trigger is invoked, and then of course the berm, how that's managed as well.
To Bonnie's point, though, and I think Bonnie made a good point, which is the mapper is a rough cut. That's really public and outward. So I don't think we have to wring our hands so much over that, right? Because mostly people just gonna look at it for trends and rough out. But for us, and we have the most credible sort of standard this committee needs the most credible.
Right, and it could flex with season and it could flex with depth depending on what's going on.
Right. Tom and then Bill.
Just a comment, we're talking here about brine shrimp and salinity, but that's what it is. We're not worried about the brine shrimp business prospering necessarily. We're trying to preserve the ecosystem by these decisions. For example, in House Bill 513, which has of course been a political hardship on extraction, there's some salinity that you should cut off brine shrimping because there's fewer shrimp out there to reproduce.
Isn't that already managed
That's
by
already
the DWR?
Okay. But is it a hard number somewhere? I guess it is, isn't it? Okay. But anyway, I think we're not worried about business. We're worried about the ecosystem. Right. Okay.
And that's why John mentioned flies and
Yeah.
the flies at the marina last week were amazing.
Rebounding dramatically, which is great because invertebrates are so much, they respond so much quicker than like birds.
Okay.
So
What's the life cycle on brine flies?
As far as
From an egg to a adult, is that 1 year, 2 years? 7 instars, I know that every year they go the whole process.
I think we would know less about it, but it can be fast depending on time of year. I mean, they spend their winters, and everything slows down in the larval stage. But
Like maybe
Right
that's 6
now-
to 9 months or so, right?
right now, they can lay eggs, hatch, grow, and repeat because of the water
So-
temperatures, right? I mean,
So they could get a generation or two in the summer.
I've got more than 2,
Okay.
yeah.
And they need the stromatolites as their rooker.
well, that's what they mostly feed on. It may not be as difficult. They overwinter on those microbialites and in that larval form. Now they could be consuming algae in the water column or on the microbialites. It's a little different this time of year.
So we've deployed some concrete blocks around the lake that are fake substrate. It doesn't provide food until the mats start colonizing them, which they are colonizing them. So they get both food and pupation habitat where they can latch on. So they can latch on to something else that's hard. We found them on pickleweed in some ponds, for example. But they do need that for food as well.
So has anyone looked at the stromatolites that have been re-immersed this year? Are they coming right back?
Slow, the mat growth is slow. But it's coming.
Let me just, one thing, if you're designing experiments, I'm gonna be opposed to it. Putting people in ice water and setting their hair on fire, that's.
Bill.
I want to say that everything I've heard so far seems to say that we should continue an explicit tracking of the 4 layers, at least internally, right? I mean, what Christine's done is shown we can have a nice, accurate, public-facing figure for hydromapper and such, but it seems like we need to track the 4 layers. One point that sticks in my mind is that when we had the destratification event in 2014, the deep brine layer was robust and it actually produced, when it mixed, a very significant increase in the salinity of the overall water column. And so understanding the potential role of mixing that deeper layer is important. So I propose that we do track 4 layers, at least internally in the committee.
And yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Bill. I think the other question is, I think this is a great analysis of what we observed here in the last month or so. I'm just, and this is probably a good number for us to look at now. Here's where we think we are now. But I think as we look toward a methodology to be used going forward is it probably, I guess I wonder how this how might this change if these were fall numbers or if we had a deep line there. Because I think our goal from what we've been talking about is our goal is we want to make sure that in the spring, we have a low enough salinity that the brine shrimp that's a critical endpoint that they can hatch and they have the best chance to hatch. And so if that's our critical endpoint, I'm coming back and maybe the fall isn't important. Maybe it's, we want to be able to characterize the changes in salinity across these different depths, and what is most important for those brine shrimp. And so I think, Bill, yes, I think we want to maintain, keep sampling these different depths and track that.
I'm hearing that we need three things. We need a number that is reported out to the public. We need a number or a range that's reported to, say, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner for decision making. And then we need, in this committee, we need a formula that is plastic, that we can learn from, that we can evolve with, in order to compute the number, or I'm going to call it the Great Salt Lake Commissioner number, whatever that number is. We need more explicit work in this committee in order to produce that number. Does that sound right? We're talking about three different things.
Yeah, I think I think it sounds like there's some more work that we can do to look at, if we were to choose one or two of these scenarios like Christine did, how might, based on more sampling events, how might that change? Try to understand.
Christina raised though.
Yeah.
Amen.
Hey, Jeff, I'd like to second giving Christina a raise, but also just comment that I think that the numbers that we have, like having different number sets floating around, they really do need to speak, because I think that if the number, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner number, or the number that we set as a threshold for making management decisions is different than what's out in the public, it could be quite confusing. And so, like, if there was a way that our equation, resulted in that exact number and there was no difference in that. I mean, I think that's what you're saying, Bonnie, but like our equation needs to be the number that the commissioner and the hydromapper uses.
Yeah. So, and I think that what Bonnie was getting at, is back to this representative versus explicit. And I think what we're trying to, we need the explicit data to try to, to keep understanding how the dynamics of the lake and continue to improve. I think that's your scenario 3. But then I think scenario 2 and 1, we're looking for a number that's representative that we can make, we can make decisions from. And, it makes sense that, we've certainly seen what happens when we have different ways of reporting salinity. If we can keep those consistent. I think the important, the critical path right now is trying to, what number should we use for making decisions, and to be able to communicate that out to the respective parties around the lake, the stakeholders, and then, I think that can also be communicated out to the public. But I guess I want to make sure we've got time to talk about these other things too, is that, I think there's a couple of things here. One is we want to keep measuring at these different depths to track those trends and understand how these, understand these dynamics. I think number 2 is that, sounds like taking an average of the different sites that were sampled across the lake on a given day at the depths sounded like we landed on from that 0.5 down to 5 meters. That's what USGS is measuring on a monthly basis. And so if we were to take the average of your three measurements,
Average of what depth?
the average of their three depths, the 0.5, the 3, and the 5. That way, I mean, it is capturing that fresh water lens at the top. But that's reality. I guess that's what brine shrimp are experiencing too. That might be even happier place for them.
And the flies.
And the flies. But if we, I'm just throwing this out as a straw man. If we use that top 5 meter, you know, as the brine shrimps and brine flies happy place in the water column, and you take the average of those three salinity measurements across your 3 or 4 or 5 sites that you measure in the open water, then that can give us an average or representative salinity value for that upper water column.
Just, I want to interject, just to be clear. So it's where these measurements are made are 0.5 meters below surface, 3 meters below surface, and 0.5 meters above bottom. So that last one is not, you know, that deep one is not always 5 meters, right? 0.5 meters above bottom.
And it was, I mean, I think designed to capture the deep brine layer when
Yes.
it was present. And so, yeah, it's tricky. I think this approach I did is for this condition we're seeing right now, which is we have gradients in salinity throughout the water column. When there's a deep brine layer present, I think it really will complicate it, because then you'll be, there's just, I think there's two, it's almost like we need two different salinities. One is for the fall computation of what we expect in the fall. That's when we need all the mass in the system, all the mass in the south arm, and we need a salinity representative of that. And then I think you're talking about something separate in the spring, which is you want a salinity that's representative of where just the brine shrimp are. And so I don't know if that's an idea of kind of having two separate approaches for each of these seasons, just because of the dynamics at play, and what you're trying to target in the spring is unique from what you're trying to target in the fall, I think, if I'm understanding correctly. But yeah, Brian's right. So when we have a deep brine layer, that sample at half meter off bottom, that will be, you know, a deep brine layer sample. And I'm not sure you want that in your computation when you're trying to figure out what the happy place is for the brine shrimp. So it's
Mark?
Yeah, just, you know, the existence of this committee is, you know, due to the complexity of this problem. And so we expect to get the answer right now is probably a little naive. The other thing to recognize is this is a two-dimensional model of the lake. And we hope to be able to get eventually to more of a three-dimensional. What does that freshwater plume do? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it good here and it's bad there? Is a more stagnant part of the lake good or bad? And, you know, again, I think as long as we're willing to evolve and not to, you know, quickly grab a number because we want to declare victory or it favors our position, then I think we'll be okay. But I just think we do need to be careful, making sure we don't over-publish what we don't know, I guess.
Right. No, that's a great point. And go ahead, Bonnie.
What if we have 3 different equations and we work with that this season and we see how different the numbers are, and we understand, you know, we start to understand how they work, and which one gives us the best result we can use.
Jeff, one comment I'd like to make is that, you know, we're going to be forced with, you know, making a decision really soon here on what it will look like, you know, assuming that Brian is in agreement with this protocol on what it looks like to lower the berm and how much we'd want to do. And so I think if there was some way that we could say, you know, we know that we're going to have to come up with a more robust protocol and have better measurements by the time we hit April of next year, when we are due to like come up with a, you know, a longer term recommendation. But that gives us a chance to see what happens this fall as well. And so I think that if we can continue to measure at the depths that Christine is representing and try to encompass different scenarios in the meantime, that would be really beneficial to making our recommendation in April. But for now, you know, if we can simply settle on one of these methods that we all agree on, and I think right now it really, from what I'm seeing that Christine put out there, I don't know that it's going to matter that much, because I think in pretty much all scenarios, we would be releasing water and salt to the north arm. And then the real decision would come in the fall when we decide how much to raise the berm again, if it's necessary. And at that point, I think like by the time evaporation season occurs, we're probably going to be in a scenario where we're, up in the, maybe as high as being in the, above the 160 threshold again, potentially. So, I think this year, because of where we're at and where we started with salinity, it's probably not as critical that we get this perfect as it will be for the April recommendation.
Yep. Well, I guess I want to make sure we keep this moving. I mean, would anybody be opposed to using that number and the methodology that Christine highlighted there? I think that's what we've been talking about is we want, well, that 135 number is the average of salinities from all depths minus the shallow at 2267, which is where the Bear River is coming in.
And I highlighted that because it was most comparable to this volume weighted concentration, which is not, I don't think, representing what you want for your brine shrimp or brine fly. So that was my assumption at the time, but it sounds like maybe that's evolved and that's totally fine. So if you want a more shallow representation of salinity, then maybe you keep shallower.
0.5 and a 3.
Yeah. My highlight was just based on this volume weighted concentration and it being closer to that. So,
yep. Bill.
Do we want to tie these to explicit depths, or do we want to make these, percentages of depth across the water column so that we don't tie these to a specific elevation of the lake? So in other words, the top and bottom 10% depths and then in between, right? I think we might want to do that rather than tie these to a specific depth, but I'm not sure of that, but I think it's worth discussing that.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
My own suggestion is we've got a pretty good straw man. We ought to call this an interim deal, let it study a while. I don't think we want to cast the idea that we've come to the final answer. I'd be interested to know what's the right depth for brine flies. I assume it's 3 meters and less, generally. I don't know this.
The right depth for them?
Yeah.
As long as the buoyancy is such that they could get to the bottom, and as long as the light penetration is such that the mats can grow. So I don't think we have a number, but it can be deeper than that.
But I think what we're hearing though, is that we're going to capture that at the water column. Yeah. And I think what's important here is that, if we use only the 0.5 and the 3 meter depth values, we're at 123, which is fantastic because we met our goal. If we're at 135, that means that we've got, there's some more that we can do to try to bring the salinity down again. So I think Tom, I like your suggestion and Ben and a number of you said is that we've got a good straw man here of different scenarios, and I think this certainly gives us an idea of what's representative of the lake right now, and let's, I guess, put a thumbtack in this and let's hold this as something that we can, and I'm just thinking, how can we improve upon it? It's probably, over time, we're going to get more and more sample events that are going to help us see how these vary. And I don't know if we can look back in time, but I think you've laid out a great, I haven't heard any new scenarios to look at. So I think this gives us a good idea of what's going on out there. And yes, Tom, I want to move on.
And just one last thing, and I think we're going to move into it anyway. All of these plans for the future require some prognostication of what the precipitation is going to be. So when you look at salinity, we're talking salinity April 1st or on September 1st or some other date, and the weather can change. I'm scared to death to put a berm plan together. If you have another year like this, 83, 84, 85, and 86, we're all pretty darn wet. It's going to change than if we're at 2000, was it 17 blip or 18 blip, whichever that one wet one was. If you extrapolated off that one, then you'd be all completely wrong because we had some pretty dry years. So I just think the complexity of trying to manage that berm when you don't know next year's precipitation, very challenging.
Well,
the
I think that's why we're trying to capture what, this year we would say, how much salt do we want to export? And then how much would we want to raise the berm up again to capture that fresh water? And knowing that there's some variability in precipitation, I think is going to be a risk that we all understand and have to take. But Jeff, I do want to say though, I think we do need to walk away today with some agreement on how we're going to make our decisions for, the next month or two with this berm. And I think if we can adopt the straw man that we have here, that gives us what we need for this particular cycle of modifications. But then agreeing that, this is something we're going to evaluate after we have more information in the coming years. So I would like to leave today with some level of decision on where we're standing with this measurement and how we're going to base those decisions.
Yeah, Christine.
So one more thought. I guess thinking about this again, and if we have a representative salinity for now, that it impacts the decision made for the fall condition of the berm. I do think you kind of need a salinity that encompasses all depths in the water column, assuming that salinity is going to mix in throughout the south arm and that it is going to affect brine shrimp throughout the summer and fall. And so I think at this moment, it's good to know that at the shallow depths, we have a salinity that's favorable to where these organisms are. But in the fall, assuming that we're going to have a more well-mixed water column, I think that the salinity I have highlighted is most representative for predicting where we think salinity will be given a certain level of fault decrease. If that makes sense, I think it's like we have to consider all of the salt mass in the system when we think about managing the berm because it's going to mix in, right? Does that make sense? So
Christine, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at as well, and I think you stated it very, very eloquently. But the salt mass is what we should be worried about in the north arm or south arm, because this is what I think got us into trouble in the first place, is that we had that deep brine layer that formed. And when the deep brine layer started to mix, that's when we really saw salinity spike. So I think that trying to encompass the salt mass and, is what we need to do, and doing anything else would be a little bit negligent when we're trying to talk about exporting salt to the north arm.
All right. So I guess what I'm hearing is that, if I guess the proposal is the proposed recommendation would be to use the volume weighted concentration, right? And because that is a number that is what we use to calculate the salt mass. It represents the full or what's going on within the lake, and it may perhaps be skewed a little bit on the high side because we do have in the spring we have lower salinities at the surface. So it's a conservative number, I guess we could call it, but it fully accounts the explicit numbers that we're measuring. Is there any thoughts on that? I agree with Ben. I would love to come away with a method that we can use as a straw man moving forward, and certainly we can keep testing it and potentially even changing it. But I think having a method that we can agree on now that we can go forward with at least gives us a place to start as we look at these other numbers.
As long as we call it a straw woman, I'm okay with that.
Straw woman, sorry,
Straw person.
or straw dog, or I've heard straw dog. Anyway, it's a trial number or method. So is there any opposition to that?
One last comment. Politically, Ben, is it correct we're going to go through some kind of rulemaking to establish what our limits are?
Yeah, so the emergency trigger will be something that will have rules associated with it, and it's everything that we have in HB 513 that we have rulemaking authority on will be done this. We're hoping to have it completed this summer, and we're already engaged in that process, and we'll start reaching out to stakeholders as soon as we have a draft that's worth sharing.
Yeah, the rulemaking could take more than a year, right?
We're hoping it won't. We hope to have our rules and our outreach completed by the end of summer, and having the rules in draft before November and to DAR for review.
When we met with you and Jamie a few weeks ago, you said the rulemaking probably wouldn't start till the end of the year and it would take 18 to 24 months to complete. Is that not correct?
I think we were talking about the plan. We have administratively, we have 6 months to draft rules. So the bill was in effect by May 3rd. So there was never an intention to draw it out for a year and a half. It's something that we would have to have done by November, according to the way the rules are put out.
Okay. Great. Well, let's use that volume weighted concentration separated into 2 bays method as our method going forward then. Because then that number also leads into the next item, Christine, and you had on your next slide with the salt mass. And what is the salt mass in the south arm, and can we forecast what that salt mass might be this fall?
Yeah. Not to be the target of this, but I'm going to have to not agree with that. Not strong, right? Integration of the deep sample really hadn't been talked about in a robust way until today. Without knowing the distribution of the brine call, I have questions just as to the relevance of that deep sample being included in the management decisions. Again, this isn't not strongly asserting that. I just, with those questions in mind, I can't from the stakeholder that I represent, I can't align with that. But again, we'll go with the process, right? And that's fine. But I wanted to get that out there. Yeah. And again, I'm not trying to skew the numbers either way, but I gotta get my mind around that.
Right.
And understanding the distribution of the brine shrimp and the reality of that deep brine layer. So I've sampled it many times. A soup at FB2.
So a well thought out brine shrimp wouldn't stay down there. He would go somewhere else.
The difficult thing about this year is that down 5 meters. In prior years, that would definitely have been the anoxic hydrogen sulfide soup I'll talk about. This year, because it's mixed in, it's not quite that. It makes it a little bit harder to reconcile the 2 different years and how to consider this.
Yeah, it's entirely different this year.
I mean, Joe, I would expect this year without a deep brine layer that we've seen in the past for it to mix and eventually kind of have a more uniform gradient throughout the water column. I mean, like maybe at least more, which makes that lower layer, I think, relevant and in play. Whereas in prior years with that deep brine layer, I would agree with you. We would not want to use that deep layer because it was historically kind of stuck there and not available or not relevant to the brine shrimp. But this year, I think it's a little bit different, and I expect we'll start to see, that 150 gram per liter at the bottom probably begin to dilute as well, and just become it seems more relevant to me this year than with that kind of stuck deep brine layer.
As far as brine shrimp at depth, we don't have data on it, but for curiosity's sake, we actually have run cameras down in the brine layer, and the shrimp are there visibly until you get that hemocline where it all goes dark and murky, and that's below 5 meters. So that's why they'll go down that far, and they just can't utilize an anoxic brine layer.
Well, I believe that House bill does not say brine shrimp, it says biology. We need to make sure we're broad enough in our view of what is, the right depth or salinity for the biology, or at least figure out how we're going to represent that biology.
Right, that's a great point. Bill.
Yeah, we can't lose sight of the fact that, at a given moment, the deep brine layer salt may not be mixing into the overall water column, but it can mix into the overall water column, and that has to be tracked.
So is it good to, should we clarify then that volume, can't remember how you volume weighted concentration of the upper brine layer, excluding any measurements from the anoxic layer below. That way we are, because I mean that, and back to Christine, what you mentioned is that we are looking at a spring number that's protective of the biology, the critical endpoint in the spring. That's a target then. In the fall, our target is shifting, where we want to be below that 160, which is protective of all uses. So, we're we are looking at two different time periods with different conditions that are happening. And I think what makes this super challenging is that conditions out there are changing literally daily and for sure year to year. But I think if we boil down what our goals are for the spring is our critical endpoint is hatchability of the brine shrimp cysts. And so we are trying to target, that oxic zone of the lake where those cysts could have. And so I think if we do that volume weighted concentration approach, but we just have a note in there that we should not include, deep brine layer values, or then I think we can account for that. Yeah, Bill.
I mean, I think you have to have both, because you got to look forward to the possibility of mixing of that deep brine layer depending on the lake level and other factors. So I would propose that we report the volumetric weighting value both with and without that deepest layer.
Yep. No, I completely agree. We need both of those values. I think with our protocol, the decision point is targeted at the upper layer where the brine shrimp can hatch. But we need that full volume, the full depth volume weighted concentration to be able to evaluate what the salt mass is, so that we can account for the full mixing. I think so. I think. Would you like? Do we need a vote on that, Ben? Would you like to vote on that, or I think Joe, does that address your concern?
I think that voting on it would be great if we had just some, consensus or uniformity in how we're doing this. I think it would be really helpful. So then when we go to actually make a management decision, we're not going off of a conversation that we have to kind of read between the lines. If we can just decide today what we're going to do for the next two modifications of the berm, I think it'll help. I would even say in the sense of like rulemaking and the emergency trigger, that I think is probably what is more concerning to Joe and others. I think we could even agree that this rendition right now, because there's so much unknown and there's things that we need to decide on, that we wouldn't use this number for that emergency trigger, and that if salinity is going to be the emergency trigger, that's something that will be further discussed and developed over time. I don't think we have to decide today what that looks like. This is for my purposes, this is really more for what we're going to do with that berm in the next few months.
Jeff and Ben, can I ask this? Because I really want to, I want to come along, but I think I need to see it sort of written down. Is there any possibility we could vote by close of business tomorrow and just see a narrative? Not trying to delay this or be a conflict, but I want to be supportive of something I can get my mind around it. And this, we're kind of talking, there's a lot of facts and figures floating around here, but if I saw it in a concise proposal with a little more time, I might get my mind around it.
I think that this is something that we could put on the docket for the next Salinity committee meeting, and probably there may be a need to we may need to be analyzing different methods of the measurement in the meantime to try to understand this under the different scenarios that we could have to make the management decision. But we can put together something. And Jeff, do you remember when our next meeting is scheduled, or have we scheduled that? I think it's on a regular day now, right?
Yeah. At the bottom of the agenda, July 27th was the fourth.
I mean, that's pretty close, but I think if we start bumping up against that timeline, what we could do is we could just call an emergency meeting for the purposes of doing this protocol. And it could be a simple, hopefully it could be a simple meeting where we hop on and hold a vote based on the proposed, methodology or the way we intend to measure that. So if we can't wait until that July date, that would be my proposal.
I'm in favor of that. Just so we can really think this through.
Right.
And just one comment in support of Joe's position. I think we've talked about salinity in the lake colloquially here. Haven't we taken an upper layer, not going all the way to the bottom? So somehow we've got to take our new measurement and compare it to our historic so we understand what we're saying that way.
Like the data sets.
Yeah.
Well, I think we just need to recognize that this is a pretty usual scenario as far as what the lake is doing and the weird stratification.
Hey, Tom, can I ask a question just in general? When you guys are pumping from the lake, are you capturing what layer of brine are you capturing? Like, what is the salinity when it's coming into your ponds?
Well, what we're doing, and I think probably all the mineral extractors do that, we have a inlet canal and we have a sump that's probably 15 feet deep-ish. So we're drawing in more the top of the layer and we're not getting a full cut. So we're drawing the shallow part into our pump system.
Okay. So your salinities that you're bringing in are probably more representative in the top of the layer where we're measuring them.
Yeah,
Correct.
From Compass's perspective, the canal is probably 5 feet deep, 4 feet wetted, so meter and a half to the upper part of the water column bed.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, let's move on. I think we can look at, and we've talked about having those two scenarios, those two numbers that we want to move forward. Both of them volume weighted, one including the deep brine layer, one not. And then we can use that as a measuring stick as we look at these other numbers.
Before we move on, just so I'm clear on what we're reporting, what Ben's reporting requirements are for this trigger. I was just looking at the verbiage in the bill, and it comes down to the ecology of brine shrimp and brine flies. It says explicitly. So is that determination on the best situation for brine shrimp and brine flies? There's no mention of our committee. Is that happening on this committee? Is that where
that's my expectation? I don't think we'll be developing that on our own. I think that this committee is where we go to get technical recommendations for things like that. And like I said before, this doesn't have to be connected to the berm. I think this could be totally separate and probably should be.
Right.
But that's something that we'll have to dive into.
So DWR's representation on this committee will bring that information forward about how the biology is doing? Is that your role on this committee, John? Is that the only place where that gets reported, I guess is what I'm saying.
We don't have much information.
Exactly. That's why the way the bill is written, there needs to be some monitoring of flies happening in order to report on what's going on in the salinity. And I don't know, I can't tell where that's happening.
So Bonnie, that's something that we discussed, when this came out about what that looks like. And I honestly think there's a million different ways that we could skin this cat. And it could be, we could try to develop a baseline and this could be based off of like brine shrimp dispersion in the water column or hatch rates or, brine flies. I mean, I think there's different things, different indicators that could play into this. So it may not even be a salinity that applies to the whole column. It might be the actual function of the biology, but those are all things that I think we would want to start to discuss and develop that. And, that might be something that we're not able to develop our rule on in the time frame in which we have. So we might have to, have something that's more broad that says that the division will, like maybe our rule is the division will establish this threshold. And through that establishment, we'll be working through the committee, perhaps the tag. I think that the tag would be another good spot to get some of this information, but those are all areas where we could work on that.
There definitely should be some way that tag reports to this group with respect to representing that biology.
Yeah, absolutely. The different technical groups out there and other areas where perhaps even additional studies or monitoring may be necessary. Those are all on the table right now. We have additional, Great Salt Lake funding to do additional studies and monitor. I think those are all worthy ways to understand this and understand when that trigger might come into effect. But we are certainly still working out some of these details.
I would think that even the tech team, as far as prioritizing things for grants, this may increase that need for information for like brine flies.
Right. And definitely we'll report that back, but that's not in the state system every year, right? So going forward, and you can't always have a grant that's funding X, Y, or Z, There
Right.
has to be some entity that, because it all hinges on the ecology of the brine shrimp and the brine flies. So.
Right.
So the purpose of that grant money, the hot topic grants, is to
Yeah.
advance the knowledge of the Great Salt Lake. And I don't look at that as something that we're constantly funding new novel research. I think in some instances that funding could be used more like a procurement for something like this, where we're monitoring those things that directly, give the state their directions on how that management needs to occur, or learning more how the brine shrimp and the brine flies react to different salinities and different conditions. And so that you might, this is something that we're working on, but I think that we'll more than likely be focusing that money in a different direction to explicitly get information that we need to manage the lake, rather than opening it up as broad as we have in the past.
Excellent point, Ben. Just, you've got the money, just fund the thing you really do need to do rather than make it a competitive grant thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Bonnie, what you're saying is that there is no long-term monitoring of brine flies.
Yeah, what I'm saying is I hadn't read this before, so I
Okay.
can't.
Well, I think you're right, is I don't know
But I'm like,
who,
it all hinges on the thing that we don't have actual state access to that data.
if the rules are dependent upon an ongoing data set to monitor condition, then at some point, somebody should be monitoring that. Basically,
Right.
it's not a
And
research,
John should get a raise.
right. It's not a research project, it's a monitoring program.
Monitoring.
I would like to second that motion for John getting a raise.
Excellent. Well, let's, Christine, I wanted to, she spends a bunch of time on these calculations. I wanted, if you could show us what you can come up with in terms of the salt mass and
Sure.
potential fall.
Yep. Just reiterate, these are all very preliminary, but for right now, it looks like we're sitting around 1,100 million tons, calculated from these two different data sets using this kind of, all the different layers of water in the water column. So using these, Jeff asked if we could kind of predict what salinities might be in the fall and then the next spring. So just, these are kind of the numbers that feed into that. Another question was, how much has the South Arm water volume increased? So just put everything into context, I think since last November to now, it's gone up by about 2.1 million acre feet, which aligns really well with inflow volume that you calculated.
Passing our 4 gauges.
Yeah, passing our 4 gauges. Okay, then we get into a little more complexity, which is how much water volume has been exported to the North Arm based on the flow measurements we have. So I kind of just extended the analysis we did for the SALT study. So this is data at the opening, the new breach opening. This is south to north discharge in cubic meters per second for a number of different data sets. The ones that we'll be looking at are the discrete measurements, which are the circles in black, and then the linear interpolation of those measurements, which is this blue dashed line. That's the only thing we have at this time from the last fall to now. I did reach out to Sam and his students to see if they could predict discharge like they had before. That's what these green dashed lines are. Using wind speeds, using density differential, water surface elevations between north and south, they've come up with a daily or sub-daily estimated of discharge at this opening. Unfortunately, given the changes in the berm, changes to the bathymetry, they just were not able to come up with a similar estimate for this time period in the fall. So the only thing we have is these linear interpolations of discharge. But summing it from November to now, I'm estimating we exported about 147 million. Huge caveats with this. I mean, we've demonstrated that this method of interpolation is not an accurate way to estimate nutrient discharges. I bet it's in a ballpark, maybe 20–30% off, but it's not an accurate way to do this. And this does also not include seepage through the causeway, which has been kind of observed by Elliot and Andrew, and it doesn't include discharge moving from south to north at Lakeside. Our gauge is not able to measure discharge yet there. So just things to keep in mind.
So how much will you need over there? I was there May 1st, and there was a slow flow through the Lakeside opening. And the lake has gone up, what, a foot or foot and a half, so it ought to be more substantial flow coming through there than what's recently seen.
Go ahead.
I'm just saying, we're watching it really close to
Yeah.
try to, and as soon as we can get, establish our rating, we'll start reporting numbers.
We used to throw milk jugs in it and time them.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other issue is that I think our kind of anchor for our instrument there is buried under sediment. And so,
But we're not waiting for that. That's we can make it. We're waiting for enough
Flow.
that we get good representative velocities to do an index velocity rating.
Yeah, because it's, it was how deep was it, Mark? 4 inches?
Yeah. And then you can imagine what happens when the wind blows from one direction to the other.
Yeah.
It's blowing that water away from that site altogether.
Yes.
all right. And then what is the associated salt map that has been exported to the North Arm? So basically taking a linear interpolation of monthly measurements of salinity, pairing that with the interpolated discharge, estimating salt flux from south to north at that opening, shown in this these lines from fall of 2022 to the present. We add that all up, it's about 28 million tons.
And what's the inflow from the surface? 1 million tons?
That's a good question. I didn't run those loads.
It's kind of Kit Waddell of 1972. It was around 1 million tons is my recollection.
Yeah, it varies. I mean, I think we've estimated from 1 to 6, so it depends on the year. I guess that this year is much higher. But I haven't done that. Good question.
I'd be lower. It would be diluter certainly this year.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of processes we don't fully understand, and I'm curious about the idea of, as the south arm comes up, it just kind of re-dissolving,
The edges.
the edges and minerals that have precipitated there. That's unaccounted for, kind of salt being contributed to the south arm, as well as salt added, Bear Bay, that kind of flooding. And there's a lot going on. So if we use the salt mass estimate we have now, and Jeff said, okay, let's pretend that we dropped 2.5 feet to the fall. I'm assuming that inflow mass is negligible, and so taking our initial condition, we have about 6.6 million acre feet now, applying a salinity of 134 based off of the June 5th volume weighted average. Our fall lake level, if we drop 2.5 feet, would be 4191.3. That's assuming that all water loss is due to evaporation. I did not incorporate the dynamics of how much water will be exported to the south arm. I know that's going to contribute to south arm dropping. I just didn't know how to make those predictions. So this is wrong. I know we're missing stuff, but it's again kind of like a ballpark and an exercise for us to explore. So fall lake volume at that lake level would be about 5.6 million acre feet, and the salinity in the fall will be 150. That's assuming again that south and north are completely separated, which we know they're not, and it's assuming all of that drop in lake level is from evaporation. So just concentrating the salt mass that's there. That's what that's.
And if you change that to 1 foot of drop, then what does it do? Because I'm saying we're started late, we still got a substantial flow in. I don't think you're going to get 2.5 feet of drop.
Bill?
Yeah, I just want to clarify a couple things, Christine, because you showed this export to the North Arm and such, but that's actually not part of this calculation. You're just taking the spring concentration and volume, getting a mass, and then dividing it by a projected volume in the fall. There's no actual, the other things that you showed preceding this don't actually come into play, correct?
That's true, though, because I just didn't know how to predict this.
No, and I might agree with your approach. I was just a little confused by the progression of the slides. So I fully agree with this. Yeah, Tom, it may be an overestimate of the salinity, and so be it. But at least it gives us a sense of what it would be based on this simple approach. I think this is useful.
Yeah, the method's good. I just think 2.5 is not the right guess.
Yeah.
And just for some context, if we use that 1800 CFS that we measured, the last measurement at the bridge, and if I assume that that's going to happen for the next 2 months, that represents about 100,000 acre feet of water.
But we measured 898 CFS.
Oh wait, I'm sorry, 898 translates to about 1,800 acre feet per day, and then that translates to about under 100,000 acre feet over the next 2 months. So as compared to the volume that we have here, it's pretty minimal.
Yeah, having a million acre feet lost kind of outside of the Babel concentration.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, but I think the method here, I mean, these values, I think we can consider them to be conservative because we are losing water and salt to the north arm. We might not see 2.5 feet of drop. And so if we account for those, then logically, I think that fall salinity projection would be lower than the 150. Any combination of those. Yeah, Bill?
Yeah, just be careful about the effect of the loss of water and salt, the brine to the north arm, because that has a neutral effect on this analysis, right? Once you overtop the dam and you lose that brine, it doesn't affect the salinity, that is the concentration, or the volume of what's in the reservoir upstream of that dam. So don't think of that as that loss is further decreasing that left-hand term. It doesn't. But the analysis is correct, taking the current condition and then dividing it by the projected volume.
We could, maybe Tom, we could say, okay, how many feet is due to 100,000 acre feet just being exported? Say the concentration stays the same at 134 grams per liter. That will also be incorrect for the approximation. And then say, okay, then maybe that's a foot drop, and then attribute the rest of that 2.5 foot drop to evaporative concentration. Some combination. We could play these kinds of games, but it's all, and that's probably more accurate than this. I'm happy to do that if it's helpful. But yeah.
I think those might be some next steps. I think this is a great, big, giant first step.
All right, and here's an even more arm-wavy exercise of what's going to happen in 2024, spring of 2024. If we have average winter, how far will the salinity go? So this is diluting the south arm. So we take our fall condition, which here kind of listed here, lake elevation volume, salinity 158, which we computed in the previous slide, which is wrong. As the wind flows to it, I assume 4 grams per liter, and then the inflow volumes I'm using are these scenarios here. So I do 2 different scenarios. 1.4 million acre feet, that's our average for the from 2010 to present. 1 million acre feet and 0.7 million acre feet. So, and these are kind of associated lake levels, lake elevations. And again, this is assuming this is all water is all going into the south arm and diluting the south arm. That's basically assuming a berm height of what, about 4196 or something. And then computing a spring concentration. So you can see the different scenarios here. For an average, we get 127, and then it kind of goes up as the inflow volume goes down. So again, incorrect.
Does this count for direct precipitation as well?
It's inflow lumping all of it, rivers and precipitation. It would just be that's the amount of water enters the south, 1.4 million acre feet for this first top one. It's just water added.
So I think
Good point. It's just volume of water added.
But the precipitation probably ought to be 800,000 acre feet, right? So that means the inflow is going to be another 600,000 is all?
That's true. Maybe these are this. I did use the average inflow computed using the river inflow, and then you're right. When I
You need
use
to
it
add the
here,
precip to it.
yeah, we could add the precip to it. Yeah.
Well, I think this is super helpful. Kind of gives us, I mean, they're not absolute numbers. They're definitely, as I said, we're kind of hand waving, doing the best we can with what we have right now. But they kind of give us an idea of the direction we're headed. And I think, you know, I think it's encouraging based on where we were last year that we were concerned about. I think the key thing is how can we now use these, can we improve upon this methodology to help provide some more certainty when we make the recommendation. So I think I'm just looking at time check here. We're just before noon, and I think what we want to be able to discuss at our next July meeting, the intent is that we would be evaluating and making a recommendation as to how we modify, if and how we modify the berm. And so I think just penciling some of the scenarios out are, if the protocol that we had, says that we want to keep the salinity, the projected salinity for the fall below 160, and we wanted to have the spring salinity to be less than 130. And so I think based on this initial calculation, it looks like we're really close on the 160 for the fall. And that's a conservative, I think feels like a conservative number. This is all about feeling. And we're tummy rub, here. And then I think from those numbers, again, with some conservative low inflow volumes for the next spring, we're really close to that 130 number. So if that was the case, then I think the decision is, okay, well, do we need to lower the berm, to meet those salinity targets? And I think lowering the berm would allow us to export more salt to the North Arm and provide some additional cushion on these to bring the salinities down further than what we see here. So I guess I just want to prep people to start thinking about that, is that I feel like we're kind of on that edge of, well, maybe we don't have to lower the berm from a purely a salinity standpoint. If we lower because we're close to that threshold based on what we know. If we lower the berm, that's going to give us some buffer, some additional confidence that we can meet our salinity targets for next spring. So that's, I think, one. The one is, I guess we could say, well, let's hope that our hand waving is good and we're, leave it. Or secondly is, let's lower the berm to be able to provide some additional confidence that we'll hit those salinity values next spring. And again, that's all premised upon with a protocol that we would raise the berm again to be able to capture that inflow over the winter, spring. And that's what these calculations are assuming, that we're capturing those inflows to dilute. So I guess any other scenarios that you can think of? Is what I want to do, I guess, here is Bill.
Yeah, another scenario that we're not going to solve today, but that I want to raise is that the fact that when the inflows come in from the Bear, they're moving to the north side of Fremont Island and directly into Carrington Bay. And another management scenario is to force those flows, don't let them enter north of Fremont Island and force them deeper into the South Arm for better mixing and therefore better ultimate salt export to the North Arm under these high elevation conditions, high lake elevation conditions. we should be thinking about that as an alternative to fiddling with the berm.
Oh, that's a great point. You know,
Except that infrastructure is not in place and it costs money, right?
right. But it's a mechanism to try to manage the salinity of the south arm. I think that's something we should definitely include in the mix in our discussion. I guess that said is I think next in July when we meet again, you know, we need to focus on, you know, these recommendations. So what I guess what I would propose to do is I'll take the list of questions that I had originally put together. I think there's, you know, we haven't even had a chance to talk about, you know, the equilibrium between the south arm and the north arm, how much water, you know, is going to go into the north arm, and where would water levels go. That's all information that I think improves the confidence of our decision here. But I will send that out, and I guess I think, Christine, if you wouldn't mind continuing, I don't know, I guess thinking about this and see if and how we can improve on this. You know, I know Layla and Craig were working on trying to look at how does the flow through the berm, through the bridge, how does that interact with the different water levels in the north arm and the south arm, to try to understand that better. But I guess what we want to do, and maybe, I guess what I would propose is, you know, after the 4th is that I schedule a conference call for anybody here who's interested, just to check in on the calculations that we're doing, and not to make decisions, but just to talk through the methodologies that we're doing, and just to provide some additional input, because I know when we're waving our arms around in the air, you know, it'd be nice to know that we're pointed in the right direction. And so I think if we can get some input from the committee, other people on the committee, that would be very helpful. Yes.
One other question I just thought about sitting here. We've got about 5 feet ahead across the causeway right now. The railroad's going to start getting concerned because they don't want to have a phreatic line that's going to cause foundational problems on that railroad. So I'm not even saying what we should do or whatever. I'm just saying,
Right.
if we let that increase too much, the railroad will be a player begging for more water to get through.
Yeah, great point. So I think, so in terms of action items, I'll summarize what we talked about today and try to get this out ASAP, and with the list of these questions, and then I'll try to schedule a meeting right after that week. I don't even know what day the 4th is on this year. Tuesday. So maybe later that week, at Thursday, we can I'll get a Teams call set up so that we can talk. And for those who can join, it was just an update with the intent that then we can refine and hopefully improve upon what we have before our meeting on the 27th. And we're really kind of gearing up for the 27th to be where we discuss and make a recommendation to Forestry, Fire and State Lands and DWQ as far as what should we do with the berm. You know, that's cool. Do we leave it? Do we lower it? And if we lower it, you know, do we go, you know, drop it 2 feet or back to 4187? You know, what should we do? And I guess I'm hoping is that these calculations of looking at the volumes and water levels can help us see, you know, if we drop it to 4187, does that do anything for us? If the lake is an equal, you know, if the two arms are in equilibrium, we're not going to see much flow go through or change. But where is that sweet spot? Joey,
are we going to have an interim vote on the methodology, or would that be the meeting report?
I think then, great point. I think my feeling is that it would be great to see what those numbers, how those numbers change maybe that's another list action item is if we, yes, I'll talk to Ben. And 'cause I think with what we're trying to do, I mean, right now, I mean, if we're using these numbers here, we're talking about a difference between 134 and 135. With the numbers that we have. So I think the key question is going forward, part of the new protocol next April that's where it's going to be super important. So I think if it were just me, I would love to see how those numbers differ with different conditions or different years.
That vote thereafter.
And then be able to vote on that. Does that make sense to everybody? If so, anyway, let's proceed with that, and I think we can vote on the 27th, and I think at this point I don't know if the numbers are going to change much with either method. So I think let's focus on these calculations and try to improve our confidence as to what's going on.
But if we could summarize what specifics are of what's being voted on, because there's a lot of content there.
Yes. I know, we didn't even get to probably 30% of the content here. So there is a lot on it. So yes, I plan to summarize those, and I guess I'll talk to Christine and try to say, okay, here's these numbers, at least we'll send it today. And so we can see those and review those. All right. Anything else I'm missing?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. So I guess with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn. All in favor? All opposed? Have a great day. Tom, you're
Too long. Go another hour.